Hello and welcome to the My Dietitian Journey Podcast. My name is Adam, your co-host and producer with me, of course, Felicia Peraza of Peraza Nutrition and My Dietitian Journey. We're going to get into some stuff today. What are we talking about?
We're going to talk about contract work and working in bariatrics.
Something you've been doing a bit of recently over the summer as well as a little bit into the fall.
Yes.
So we're going to get into companies and fields of work that you've done personally and your feelings and thoughts on those things. So we want to talk about contract opportunities to get started. Do you want to talk about the company you've been working with?
Yeah, so the company's called Dietitians on Demand, which really fitting because it's for dietitians and they're on demand. So they provide dietitian staffing and they provide registered dietitians in hospitals, long-term care facilities, dialysis centers, community settings. So most of the job postings that I tend to see were actually centered around like long-term care, but recently I've been seeing more of like outpatient kinds of settings, but you can basically use them in two different ways. If you're a facility and you're looking for temp dietitians, you could reach out to them, submit. There's a form on their website for requesting for staffing. But then also if you are looking to find like a job opportunity as a dietitian, remote or in person, they pretty much always have short and long-term contract opportunities.
And then another company could be Upwork?
Yeah, Upwork is one. Some people find this, I was just looking at it recently, but people find like different kinds of dietitian jobs for like hiring one-on-one, or I've been seeing a lot of like companies looking for like an expert like dietitian, and they'll specify dietitian to be able to just provide like expertise in an area. So a lot of it was like around supplement companies, somewhere like blog writing and things like that, but just some other options for just, other kinds of side work or things that could turn into something long-term.
So just to clarify, contract work, it's you sign up with a company and then you work on a site. They tell you where you're going and what you're doing, and you're working on behalf of this company that other companies reach out to. It's kind of like a middleman sort of, and you work for them technically. You don't work for whatever business you end up in. You're actually working for the contract company.
Yeah.
It's an easy way to pick up some extra work. You can kind of get in pretty quick.
Yeah. And there's like an onboarding process to work with Dietitians on Demand. And some of it's just like their paperwork stuff and like an interview process, but then also then they would forward you on to whoever the client is that they're, helping to hire for basically. But then once you're in. And so like I have job alerts that I just kind of stay signed up for. And there's always something happening in terms of like opportunities. And it's just a good way, especially if you're looking for something part-time, or if maybe you're not sure exactly what you might want to do. It's a good way to kind of get some experience in different areas. And there's a lot of times where they're looking for new grads, or they're looking for people who can do travel, and they'll often reimburse for like mileage and stuff like that.
How did this start for you? Like, how did they first... Did you contact them or did they contact you?
So I had known about them. I think another dietitian had mentioned them like years ago. And most of the work that I saw was for like long-term care facilities. And there was a few opportunities where I had seen them and I was like, oh, I'll apply for this. And I didn't get, whatever the contract was because there was someone more qualified, because I've never worked in long-term care besides the little stint in my internship, which is not much. It was like 2 weeks. And this opportunity that I saw for the contract that I'm still with was actually for an outpatient bariatric facility. And it was associated with a hospital system. But it was something that I'm like, oh, I have, experience in an outpatient setting, and I've had patients who have been post-bariatric surgery before. So, and one of the qualifications was someone to be like empathetic and skilled in motivational interviewing. And I'm, well, this is great because this is obviously something I practice, but I also teach this topic at school. So this is right up my alley. So what's interesting is I actually ended up knowing the person who was at the site that was looking for a dietitian too. So my name was familiar. So I think that also gave me a little bit more of an in outside of my experience too.
But you originally saw an opportunity for an outpatient dietitian in bariatrics on Dietitians on Demand website or something?
Yeah, it was listed on their website, and I'm signed up for their email alerts too. So they send like a weekly, or I think it's weekly, if not it's every couple of days, with the listings, and they're across the United States. There's been others like South Carolina I just saw recently. So a lot of times I'll just scroll through and just kind of see what's on there. But I did see it on one of their email
Are
blasts.
do you know if they're in Canada too?
I don't know, actually.
Post pending for that information. It'll be in the description. So you applied for that position listed on Dietitians on Demand website, and you sort of had a warm introduction because somebody there already knew you. Do you think your experience would have gotten you the job otherwise?
I think so, because I had been working in obviously outpatient with, being in a private practice. And I did have a few patients that I had worked with that were post-bariatric, not, a couple days later after having surgery, but usually like a couple years down the line after having had bariatric surgery. But the big part of it was that I was familiar with using an EMR. I was not familiar with using Epic, which is the EMR system that they use, but I was familiar with using an EMR. And I also, again, the motivational interviewing side of things and like having high empathy for working with that kind of population was something that I do again in my, outpatient practice, but also teach. And I think that gave me a lot of a kind of a leg up on it because I had experience in those areas really steep.
So when you applied for the position, the client, the company interested in having a dietitian come in, they saw your application on a portal on their end through Dietitians on Demand or something.
Yeah. So like the first step is you connect with someone at Dietitians on Demand. They do like an initial screening on, onboarding and an interview process. And then they usually send one or two candidates depending. And sometimes they'll have then the site make that final confirmation. But the site has to confirm whether or not they are in agreement with who Dietitians on Demand would want to hire and who they think would be a good fit. But sometimes they'll send one candidate depending on the number of applicants, or sometimes it's multiple. And then that site makes that final determination. So I don't know how many people they had interested in this position, but I do know that the person that was at the site that was making the final decision along with Dietitians on Demand knew who I was. I didn't know that they were in this position and looking at the application though, which is funny.
Okay. So just to wrap it up, because I'm wrapping my head around it too. Dietitians on Demand has a position at a site. Mm-hmm. You apply and your application hits Dietitians on Demand first.
Yes.
They screen you and then send 1, 2, maybe 3, candidates to the site to say, here's who we've got. Now you pick who you want.
Yes.
So they kind of screen out any obviously unfit candidates.
Yeah. And that's where Dietitians on Demand does like that first initial screening process. But yeah, if there's like a couple of good candidates, then it would be up to that like final site to, the site that's looking for the dietitian to make that final decision.
It works similar in contract management for other stuff too. Sodexo, Aramark, that sort of thing. So, you applied for that job, you got it, the site, the client picked you. Mm-hmm. And once you're in, so to speak. What exactly do you mean by that? There's an onboarding process you had to go through for Dietitians on Demand? That's a one-time thing if they send you elsewhere now, if you get other work through their organization? Yeah,
so their onboarding process was like drug screening, making sure that all your vaccinations and all that were up to date. And then like your license and all that kind of your resume, some of that kind of like just general like employee kind of paperwork to have on file. And then the site itself also had specifications because mostly what I was doing was telemed, but they had requested that I come on site a couple of days just to observe, which kind of turned into a couple clinic days down the line. But so I needed to make sure that I had everything like up to date in terms of like boosters and all that kind of stuff, PPD things, to be on site, and seeing patients, face to face.
So now that you're in and you've gotten through that process with Dietitians on Demand so that you could hit the site and actually work for them, now you don't ever have to do that again if you pick up additional work through Dietitians on Demand, I assume?
Yeah, it's just keeping most of that stuff current, which, with any kind of position that you like. For me, I have to get the, different lab stuff sent in, but it's all pretty simple.
So the process is expedited if you get another contract at a different site down the line.
Yes.
And you're kind of in the inner circle, I guess, to an extent now.
Yeah, I'm in like their payroll system and like all that kind of stuff. So it's a lot easier to just maintain all of that information versus having to go through all of the onboarding initially.
And you would typically recommend this to someone who's looking for part-time, per diem sort of extra work or exposure to different aspects of dietetics. But does it also form the capacity for perhaps making connections that would allow you to pick up full-time work?
Yeah, it definitely does. And this is also really great if someone like moves and they're looking for a new job and they do something temporary, because a lot of the sites, like even the site that I was at, they needed to hire someone full time and they ended up needing multiple people full time. So I ended up bouncing around a few sites, but that's exactly what you could be doing is you go somewhere for 4 weeks, 6 weeks. And sometimes it specifies like they're looking for a 2-month contract and full-time opportunity is available. So they are often looking, to have you come temporary, and if they want to continue working with you and I feel like you'd be a really good fit, then they would want to probably keep you on afterwards, not just as a contract employee, but being hired into their system.
So it's possible to get hired as a full-time employee through this contract work, and then what, they would buy out your contract, I think you said before?
Yeah, I think I don't know exactly how it works, but it's along the lines of either you finish out your contract and then like the site has to do like an agreement with them to Dietitians
on Demand. So that's not frowned upon. It's something that happens. It's not, maybe not necessarily encouraged, but it's normal to happen.
And again, a lot of the job listings, even some of the ones that I saw recently say like, potential for extended contract or, permanent position or permanent placement or something like that. So a lot of places might be looking for someone like temp to, all the way permanent. So.
Okay. It's just an option for finding really any kind of work in any kind of industry, any kind of subset of dietetics.
Yeah.
Seems like a good opportunity.
And a lot of times they'll say on there too, like new grads welcome. So if you're a new dietitian and you're like, I don't have any experience, I'll see a lot of that on there too. Or someone like, even like the long-term care, the one I applied for before, I was like, I don't have any long-term care experience, but I'll just see what happens. And they did end up having someone for the one I applied for previously, but that's always an option too, that if you're not, in that space already.
Would you recommend someone fresh out of college pursue something like this if they're open for it?
I think it depends. I mean, with a lot of like long-term care facilities, that there's a little bit more onboarding that might happen. And I just know nothing really about long-term care anymore.
Well, not necessarily long-term care. I mean, Dietitians on Demand or contract work.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think it's a great option for being able to like, especially short-term, be in a place, but it can be a little hectic with being new to just a facility and trying to learn like a facility in a very short amount of time. And you're essentially picking up because they need someone. So you have to kind of like learn things really quick. But if that's you and you're the kind of person who could pick up things really quick, it's definitely a really good option.
I guess maybe the money is a little better than picking up a full-time spot somewhere. I don't know if this is related at all to travel nursing, but I know a lot of people are making a lot of money doing something like that. That's kind of short-term contract work as well. I'm just wondering if this is sort of a long-term option, possibly for the first few years out of college, if it's a good way to get your feet wet, and also something where it's reasonable or realistic to expect you'll actually get the work as a new dietitian.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely I don't see as much in our area, like Philly, Fairless Hills necessarily, but there's always stuff that I see coming up in Pennsylvania. And so, and a lot of times it'll say like, relocation or travel time or things like that, mileage reimbursed if beyond a certain period. So I think if you have the option to be able to like travel or, have the time to do so, especially if you're between things, I think you definitely can find opportunities to fill the gap.
Yeah, if you're willing to hit the road and sort of just live here for a few months and there for a few months, it could be a good way to travel and see some of the country and also make good money along the way. So do you want to get into specifically what you did for your contract working in bariatrics?
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about what bariatrics is before we jump in?
So it's people who are interested in getting a bariatric procedure. So individuals who are, obese, morbidly obese, like clinically diagnosed and have usually, other conditions like diabetes, heart disease. And there's, certain criteria to be eligible for bariatric surgery, but we're talking like things like gastric bypass and sleeve gastrectomy. So those were like the two most common ones that were done, at least at the hospital system that I was at. There's other ones like the lap band or things like that, but they weren't mostly the procedures that were being done at the hospital that I was at.
So you worked at a facility that specialized in preparing people to have bariatric surgery?
Yep. So it was an outpatient portion of the hospital. And so I saw people from before and after having had bariatric surgery. So everything from those initial appointments to, learning about what it is to, the appointments leading up to their surgery, which are referred to as like medical weight management appointments, to post-surgery managing their nutrition.
So it could have been, some of your patients were well beyond their surgery, 2 years down the line, let's say.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot that goes into managing your nutrition with having that surgery.
Yeah, long-term care.
So what was your schedule like when you were working for this site?
So it was interesting because I originally was supposed to just be at one site in July and August, and then ended up going to a couple of different sites within the system just based on the need that they had. So my original schedule was I was there on site 2 days just observing their in-person clinic days, which basically what that means is someone actually came, like if you were to go to primary care physician's office and someone like checks you in and then you go to a room and then someone comes in and takes your vitals and that whole thing. So it's like that kind of clinic day. So they would see, they would get, checked in with like either a PA or a medical assistant. And then they would see, if it was a new patient day, they would see the surgeon, they would see nurse practitioner, and they would see, the dietitian. Most of what I was doing was going to end up being telemed, although that kind of changed down the line because I, again, bounced around to 2 other sites. So one day ended up being a clinic day, and then I would do telemed. So everything was, online for the appointments, everything from the new patient appointments through the post-op visits too.
So you were working for a hospital system, and their needs sort of changed as your contract went on, and you were able to be flexible and agree to do some different things. I know you were on site additionally more than you anticipated, and you did some things you weren't expecting to do.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting to be on site that much. I thought I was supposed to be there on site just to do like 2 observation days. And then I was telemed with this first, site. And then I got moved to another site after that contract ended because they needed someone to fill in. And so I went to this other site and I did clinic days on Mondays where, again, the patient would see the surgeon, and they were post-op visits and new patient visits. So it'd be the surgeon, the nurse practitioner, and then myself as the dietitian. And then I was doing telemed days on top of that, from home. And then I also ended up teaching their nursing nutrition class, which is for patients who are 2 weeks pre-op. So they got like a crash course again in the nutrition for the pre-op and post-op diet. And then also there was a nursing portion, which typically would be taught by a nurse, but there was a few times that I had to fill in on that portion too. So those are some of like the other things. And that was also online as well. But yeah, that was like a different part because I was supposed to be just doing like the virtual component of, appointments. And then it kind of changed a little bit with some in-person days too.
What were your hours?
So usually like clinic days were anywhere from like 8 to 4:30. Clinic days were very interesting because you can have patients who, again, since it was face-to-face, they were really allotted like 15 minutes, into their appointment. But most of the time, if there was time, they would, the patient would still come in even if they were like very late. But first appointment was always at like 8 o'clock. And then the last visit was usually 4 or 4:30. So that tended to be around my hours, but I would get there or log in usually like 15 minutes ahead of time to do like pre-charting and kind of like see what was happening for the day. So I knew what I was doing, especially in the beginning of trying to like figure out how to like find everybody's charts and, figure out what I'm supposed to be seeing them for if they're a new patient and if they needed like a nutrition book or things like that, or if it was like a post-op visit, how far out were they from their surgery, which then changed what diet they were on. And so that was like the, initial part of that 15 minutes when I would get on site if I didn't have enough time to really do that between the appointments as much.
Did you want to talk about like the messaging and the stuff you were doing with all the staff and everything?
Yeah. So there was a couple aspects. So they used Epic, which is basically like, I use Simple Practice for my outpatient practice, and it's like that on steroids.
It's an EMR.
It's an EMR. But you see like everything from their labs to all of the other visits that they've had. And so it's lots and lots of information, obviously, but also navigating that. So there was lots of communication that occurred between the dietitian, the nurse practitioner, and the surgeon, like coordinating that day in terms of like whose turn it was to see the patient, if the patient was ready. That they used a lot of texting to kind of check in. And then on Epic, you can send messages. So I would often have, nurse practitioners route a chart to me to like follow up on a patient who might be post-op, maybe having any complications, nutrition information that they needed, if they were confused about what diet they were on. So that was like a lot of communication, both like in the EMR itself and then like texting basically the surgeon and the nurse practitioner as to like if a patient was ready and, who they needed to see next and what questions they had.
So I don't know if you actually said it or not, but you would do 15-minute appointments with patients, and then they would spend 15 minutes with you and 15 minutes with a nurse practitioner?
It kind of varied. So if it was a new patient visit, I was allotted like 15 to 20 minutes to see the patient. And depending on the site, because every site ended up being different, because some of the sites, it was like the dietitian always goes first and sees the patient first. And then other sites, it was like the nurse practitioner, then the surgeon, and then the dietitian is last. So that was something that was new, because then I was learning each site's rules along with that and their flow. But if it was like a new patient visit, usually it's like 15 or 20 minutes that you would get as the dietitian. The surgeon could be anywhere from like 5 minutes to like 20 minutes. So that it really varied, which, if the surgeon went first, that meant that my appointments were like way delayed. And then the nurse practitioner, usually anywhere from like 15 to 20 minutes themselves. Now, if it was like a follow-up appointment, pre-surgery, so what was the medical weight management appointments is what they called them. So they were the appointments leading up to the bariatric surgery. Those were only led by the nurse practitioner and the dietitian. And they were usually scheduled in either 15-minute appointments or 30-minute appointment blocks. And sometimes there was double bookings. So in those cases, you really should be in and out in like 8 to 10 minutes, because you're splitting the time with, the other practitioner. And then also you have another patient in like 15 minutes or 30 minutes. So,
okay. So what you're actually doing, because it just feels abstract to me right now. You've got Epic open on your computer. So you're at home. Mm-hmm. You're in our office, our home office. You're on your computer, and you've got Epic open, and maybe a couple other things open. And you see in Epic, because it's an EMR, it's got a scheduling component, and you see your schedule for the day. Mm-hmm. You see bookings per 15-minute block or 30-minute block or whatever it is.
Yep.
Say you have a client at 9, a patient at 9, and it's 8:58 or whatever. And let's just say you're seeing that patient first. What do you do?
So they use what's called Switchboard, which is basically a platform where the patient would log on to, and they use Blue Jeans for like their video conferencing. And so what would happen is I would have Epic on, I have a dual monitor setup. So I have the Epic screen open here, and then I have with the patient's chart and the schedule, and then I have Switchboard, which shows all of the patient appointments, and then there's a button that you would click to join the appointment. What's nice about using Switchboard is that you could see if the patient has joined. So like if the appointment time is at 8 o'clock, their name would show up and say that they were in Blue Jeans waiting basically for their appointment. And then I would join the appointment. You can also send like appointment reminders there too, and all that. So I would join on Switchboard, which put me into Blue Jeans. And so the video aspect of it. And then I'd be in this virtual room with the patient, and then also have their chart open at the same time to be able to see, to one, chart during the session, because that's what you needed to do and to stay on task with everything. But then that way I could see like all of their records at the same time as well.
So Blue Jeans is kind of like a HIPAA compliant Zoom kind of a thing, video conferencing?
Yes.
And then Switchboard is how you connect to the patient from your computer?
Yes.
Kind of. Mm-hmm. So there's a few things involved. So what else do we want to talk about in terms of the kinds of patients you work with?
So like I mentioned, they were, interested in bariatric surgery, and sometimes people actually don't end up being eligible for bariatric surgery, whether it's their weight or, if they don't have other kinds of medical conditions. but you would end up having to refer them to, they had like a clinic that they also referred to. But a lot of what it actually entailed was like reviewing in these like medical weight management appointments, reviewing goals for surgery, making sure they had like a support system. So I guess I didn't realize all that was involved in bariatric surgery myself. Like you don't just go in and say like, I want bariatric surgery. It kind of doesn't work that way. And also realizing how much assessment goes into it and how many specifications there are in terms of like insurance requirements as to like how many visits. Like certain insurances require 12 weekly appointments, whereas some insurances it was like 3 or 5 appointments. So it was just very interesting seeing the different types of patients, and then also the fact that there was just so much more involved than I thought with working with someone who is preparing for bariatric surgery. And that's just the nutrition side of things. Like they also needed to have psych consult and get labs consistently and have different studies done, like sleep studies and all that kind of stuff. So it's not really, I guess I had a very different understanding of bariatric surgery before going into it. So,
well, I guess it's the nutrition component's important in a way that's not for, say, like knee surgery or something.
Yeah.
Because you have to get medically cleared for all kinds of surgeries, usually for stuff like that, where it's optional or elective.
Yeah. And with bariatric surgery too, there's a lot of like most of the goal, unless the surgeon for safety reasons requires the patient to lose weight, most of the time weight loss is not the goal before surgery. I will say that a lot of patients do end up losing weight because they end up changing their behaviors. But a lot of the nutritional component is like practicing the behaviors that the patient will need to have in place after surgery. So like separating eating from drinking by 30 minutes, which is a huge one that most patients were not used to. I mean, like how many people drink at least a sip of water or something with their meals or pretty soon before and after, or like chewing food really well until it's like applesauce texture. You know, most people are skipping meals and like just kind of shoving food in their mouth and not really paying attention to, you know, sitting down and eating a meal for 20 to 30 minutes. But that's really important for after surgery because one, the volume that you can take in terms of food is so much smaller. And two, with like obviously the changes that happen with surgery, you want to make sure that you're absorbing as much as you can after the procedure. And that involves eating slowly and not eating really quickly, which then causes a lot of pain and discomfort, but also can kind of push things more quickly through the digestive system, which then can lead to what's called like dumping syndrome. So there's all of these things that can happen along with the fact that there might not be as much, you know, weight loss that occurs if you're not following along the guidelines.
So these bariatric surgeries, effectively they're well, not all of them do this, but some of them shrink the stomach. They remove a portion of the stomach.
Yeah, a portion of the stomach. Yeah.
Is that what they all do?
Most of them do. So like the gastric sleeve versus the bypass, like the bypass is more restrictive than the sleeve is. I mean, they're both, you know, serious procedures, but it's a little bit less restrictive with like the sleeve based on like how much of the stomach is removed. So
if the stomach is surgically removed, there's less capacity for them to eat food. They have to eat in smaller volume. So you're making sure part of what your goal is that the patient can demonstrate prior to surgery that they're able to consistently maintain habits that will allow the surgery to be successful post-op in terms of their behavior, right?
Yeah, and reduce the risk of complications. Like a big one is one of the reasons that patients can often be readmitted to the hospital is because of dehydration, because you can't just gulp your liquids afterwards. One, the volume again is an issue. So in order to avoid dehydration, you have to take sips of water, and it's like sips over a period of time to finish like an entire cup. And so like most patients, again, they're used to like gulping liquids or taking a straw and things like that. And you just can't do that after surgery. And so with the pain or, you know, not being mindful of like sitting and sipping your liquids over a period of time, like 1 ounce cups we're talking about, then that, you know, can again lead to dehydration. So those kinds of things, making sure they're aware, but also practicing those behaviors. And then that way after surgery, they've been already doing these things for a period of time. And it's just, you know, keeping them going versus trying to start them for the first time.
What exactly makes bariatric surgery medically necessary?
So it's not just with the obesity, but also like obesity diagnosis, but also like other conditions like with type 2 diabetes. And a lot of patients too, like it reduces with a lot of patients, it can reduce the amount of medications that they're taking, improve their quality of life, help them with managing conditions. But there's been a lot of, or with some individuals, it can help with things like GERD or things like that. And it's most people that we would see come through, at least that I saw come through, had tried, multiple diets in the past, or, they've been kind of yo-yo dieting for a long period of time. And that they've kind of reached a point where it's like something needs to happen that's more drastic for them. And this ends up being, what they end up going for.
So it's a method of treatment for obesity, diabetes, type 2 diabetes sometimes, or some other disease state that's affected by overeating particularly?
Yeah. And a lot of times, and it's interesting because it's not as much, I mean, it is, overeating is an aspect of it, but also like there's a lot of patients that I would see that the mobility that they have is just so decreased because of where they are in terms of their size. And so they're not able to move around as much and those kinds of things. So it makes it even harder for them to lose the weight on their own because it's not just, controlling the food intake, but also like, the activity level becomes really difficult for them too. So it's kind of a combination of those things, but the primary factor, like BMI is a factor. And there's obviously lots of flaws with BMI, but that's what they use for the criteria. So the BMI has to be at a certain number, but also that individual then has to have like a condition like diabetes or heart disease or something like that. That is also like I'm forgetting the term, but like when you have two conditions together, basically, to make it medically necessary. And each insurance kind of has a specification as to like if the BMI could be lower and they have, diabetes or things like that. But
the end result inevitably, or the end goal, I guess, is always weight loss.
Yeah. So generally with like the gastric sleeve procedure, it's about 60% of excess weight that's estimated to be lost in a year. And then for the gastric bypass procedure, it's like 55 to 70% of excess weight that's expected to be lost within the first year as well.
That seems really fast.
It is. And most patients lose it pretty quickly in the first couple of months. And then it's kind of more of like a slower, steady loss. And it doesn't mean that after a year, they can't lose any more weight, but that's where keeping the behaviors in place of like healthy eating and continuing with their appointments will help them with maintaining that weight loss and then also continuing with weight loss as well.
Is part of the post-op care monitoring their rate of weight loss to manage it?
Yes. So at the first appointment before surgery, we estimate what their expected loss would be. And then after surgery, their weight is monitored at every appointment. And we calculate how much they've lost since they've had the surgery and the percentage of the excess weight that they've lost as well.
Okay. So what kind of skills do you need to help people post-op, pre-op for bariatrics?
So definitely, I mentioned motivational interviewing, which is basically a style of communication. And it's kind of like a balance between listening and also directing, because you're not really telling people just what to do. A lot of it is helping someone to kind of like examine what their situation might be. And it's really helpful when someone is kind of like low confidence, not sure about change, maybe doubting their abilities to change. But what's really key in like motivational interviewing skills would be using like open-ended questions and reflections to engage with a patient in a short amount of time. So that was obviously really helpful when you're working with someone in like 15-minute increments or 10-minute increments to be able to kind of get the information that you need, but not feel like you're just spouting off a question and leaving the room. So definitely motivational interviewing as like a skill. Empathy is like a huge thing, obviously, with bariatrics, because with a patient who, and I've had patients who are in like 400 pounds, 500 pound range, and they have tried multiple diets in the past. They've maybe been frustrated with where they are in terms of weight loss, or there were lots of patients who had like depression or anxiety or a loss in the family, a death of their loved one. And then it was like all of a sudden they realized that they were using food as a comfort, and they got to a place where they're like, I just can't keep doing this anymore, but I also don't know what to do because I feel stuck in my own body. And so to be able to like work with someone, you have to be very empathetic and not just judgmental.
Yeah. So you become an advocate for the patient, and you don't judge their situation. You're just advocating for their treatment.
Yes.
Not judging how they got there.
Exactly. And that's a huge part of it too. And a lot of patients will come into the appointment and they're like, I know I'm disgusted with myself. And so they have all of this like negativity about themselves and their size at that point. They don't need someone telling them anything because they already know. They already know how it feels to live in their own body. So they don't need you to tell them anything. So really being able to work with someone and set like really small goals to be helpful, which is why it's really helpful to have some insurances that require longer, like multiple appointments, because it's not just like, here's what you need to do before surgery, but you're still working with someone who is now changing their behaviors. So that takes time and also trust. So to be able to, again, make sure that you are not just being empathetic, but meeting the patient where they are in terms of their confidence level, but also like setting goals that are appropriate for them.
That's kind of a blanket skill for healthcare in general, I would say. That's talked about in pre-hospital care too. It's being empathetic and being an advocate for the patient and just treating them indiscriminately, not judging.
Yeah.
That'll help you in any aspect of healthcare.
And that's like a big thing, especially in healthcare, that I've had patients who, again, are living in a larger body where they go to a healthcare appointment with their primary or someone, and it's telling them what to do and how, they're at a certain weight and they need to try harder. And again, when you actually listen to the patient, you'll understand that they have been trying, and that's not helpful.
Yeah, that doesn't really work. So I'm going through EMT right now, and that's a big thing because as an EMT, you respond to a lot of overdoses. And if you get to the scene in your hospital and you hop, or in your ambulance and you hop out, and you're all judgmental, like, oh, this stupid drug addict, blah blah, it's not helpful to the patient, and they're probably trying to get better. Mm-hmm. Not to relate drug addicts to obese people, but there's a level of addiction, and it's psychological, and it's probably neurochemical. It's not easy to overcome it.
It's not. And I've had patients, like I had a patient who was like, I literally spend over $100 each week on fast food. And I know that I know I shouldn't, and they list out, and I don't even say like, you shouldn't do that. I'm listening, and they're like, I know I shouldn't because I know it's not good for my health and I know it's not helping me. And they start explaining all the reasons why that has become their norm. It's quick, it's easy, it's cheap. They're not sure what to cook or how to cook. They have a family and they're trying to keep it all together. And then there's other patients who are talking about how deep their level of depression is and how it's all they can do to get out of bed and grab a bag of chips, let alone cook a meal for themselves. And so when you come from a framework of just, I'm here to listen and I'm here to help, you'd be surprised at how much someone would tell you. And it gives you a better understanding of where they are and how you can help them best.
It's a good attitude to have just in general. And it's not like they just woke up one day and they were where they are. It takes them years or decades to get to that point. It's a slow slide. It's a slope, and it's very gradual. So they just kind of end up there.
Yeah.
What other skills would you say are important?
Definitely flexibility. And that was something that I learned being in this contract, was that I very much like time frames and being on time and starting appointments on time, but you just need to be able to go with the flow sometimes. And that's maybe being able to jump in to start an appointment, or to call a patient if they're not there just yet, or to be behind in terms of the schedule. That was like a normal thing on a clinic day that I was just very much not used to. Very like time oriented. We are like 30 minutes behind. I am so behind. But so that was like a huge thing. And then also being able to be flexible with schedule changes. Like there were some days where I'm supposed to be in, clinic doing a telemed appointment. And then it's like, oh, instead, can we have you teach this nutrition class? And can you also do the nursing portion of it too? So just kind of learning those kinds of things and like being able to say like, okay, this is fine.
Just being good flexible. On your toes, just being ready for anything.
Yeah. Mentally, maybe I wasn't, but you get there.
You got through it. You certainly weren't anticipating teaching the nursing portion of a class. You're not a nurse.
Yeah.
But you could do it, and you did it.
Yeah, it was pretty basic. Just like, here's the hospital room you will be in. And, here's all the things that I don't know. So you'll talk to your nurse about that. And so it was just more so like general information. Like the nursing portion obviously is much better handled by the nurse, but it was under the understanding that I'm the dietitian just kind of reading the slides to you. So,
and one of your strong suits is time management. So happens. How does that play into this?
Yeah. So, practicing and learning systems, I created a bunch of cheat sheets for myself, which actually helped with time management. So when I did those kind of like initial sessions where I observed one of the other dietitians or went in for a clinic day, I just took notes on literally everything because I didn't know anything about the systems, their flow, and then that way I can refer back to it. But the time management portion, like actually having those flow sheets kept me, because I didn't have to say like, okay, where do I find this in Epic? Like I had a sheet for it. I like knew where to find it. Or like I knew more about like bariatric surgery, but I didn't know all of the ins and outs of like how long they might be on the pureed diet versus the soft diet and all of those things to be able to, now I have all that stuff memorized because I just talked about it so much. But I had like a sheet on that. So it would help in the appointments because I didn't have to go find the information. I had it ready for myself. So that was really helpful too with like keeping to time management. And also, honestly, pre-charting was really helpful because if a patient didn't show or if I was behind, a surgeon going into the appointment, then I can go in and pre-chart. So pull, their previous note from the dietitian, see where they were. So then that way, when I started the appointment, it was a lot different because I had a better understanding of obviously the patient, but I also kind of had key points for myself to touch base with. So I didn't forget things and again, have to like go back and, finish something that I was missing.
So you also were working in a team. It was with a bunch of other nurses and dietitians as part of a group. I'm sure communication skills played into that pretty heavily too.
Absolutely. And it's funny because, you would communicate before an appointment or after an appointment to say like if a patient was ready, and usually you gave like very brief information about what was happening with the patient, maybe what their weight was, if there was something they were really struggling with, or if the nurse practitioner was next. There's a lot of times where a patient would ask a question about something that was like more nursing specific. And so I would kind of like give them a heads up so they knew going into the appointment, which was very helpful because the nurse practitioner would do that for me too. And then I know, the patient is looking for information on switching supplements because this one is causing GI issues, or the nurse practitioner said, hey, their labs just came back and their B12 is elevated. Can you review their supplements? And I can actually do that before I went in with the patient while I was like waiting for the appointment when the nurse practitioner was in. And then that way I can, again, kind of use my time more efficiently, but it also helped with keeping that line of communication so everybody was on the same page basically for the patient. So
it's a way different world from what you usually do in your practice, because in your practice, your appointments can be anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour plus.
Yeah.
And you get into stuff depending on what the patient's interested in. In this case, you're slamming through appointments. They're a tight 15 or whatever. Time constraints are a huge issue. So that communication, allowing you to sort of get ahead of the game and pre-charting was kind of what saved you in terms of being able to keep the pace.
Yeah, especially when I was learning Epic, which I don't know everything there is to know about Epic, but I know a lot more about than I do now. But I would like all the buttons to click on it. If anyone's ever looked at it, there's just a lot of options for literally everything. And I'm like, what things actually matter when I'm in an appointment? And those kinds of things, like having things checked off. And then that way, all I had to do was like fill in gaps. And I didn't have to like start a chart from scratch with each patient. So that was really helpful. But yeah, that was a very different experience than my outpatient being able to kind of take as much time as I would like, basically.
And then also, I would say a major difference having heard you do this sort of stuff. Your appointments with the bariatric patients, they were like the same 8 questions over and over again. Versus no 2 appointments practically are the same when it comes to your private practice.
Yeah, that was definitely something. And that's where I started to get more efficient down the line because I changed the way I might have asked questions with patients based on like how the responses I was getting. But like a new patient visit, there's very specific questions that I have and information I have to gather. I have to ask them if they have a support system. I have to ask them about their living situation. I have to get a 24-hour recall. And so there's a lot of things that like I needed to hit, and like exercise, understanding what their exercise is, and then setting like specific goals with them. With like medical weight management appointments, a lot of it was setting those behavioral goals. Like, are you practicing separating eating from drinking, and kind of getting an understanding of where they are now? If they talked about having caffeine in their first appointment, I need to make sure that they've started to decrease it because they can't have any caffeine right after surgery. And so things like that, where it was like similar questions that I was asking each patient. So I ended up getting better at the flow of the appointment, but also like the specific questions to get, the best answer, to say the least, and not have to like ask a question twice or things like that. Whereas, in my private practice, it's totally different because, like you said, each appointment, someone could be seeing me for weight loss, and that's going to look way different for them than it is for someone else, just based on the conversation that we end up having with that much time.
So did you do anything to prepare for this going into it before? Because you've never worked in bariatrics specifically. So
No.
It was kind of a new world for you. Did you do anything prior to the contract to sort of get yourself up to speed or prepare?
Yeah, because most of my experience was like with patients who were like a couple years post bariatric surgery, which they have they don't really have much in terms of restrictions. So I reviewed, the facility had sent me over some specific resources that they used at their site. So like their specific manual, and then they sent me over a couple of studies that they used to, again, kind of frame what they did in terms of working with their patients. So I reviewed all that. I also, with working with Dietitians on Demand, got access to the Nutrition Care Manual, which is a really great resource for all things bariatric surgery. So everything from like the nutrition assessment process to things you would look for in terms of the interventions. And so that was really helpful. And then definitely creating like the quick sheet guides, which it's funny because I created them for myself to know what I was doing easily in like Epic. And then I ended up sharing them. One of the people at the site, dietitians, had asked me if they could have them and share them with other dietitians that they were onboarding. So I ended up sharing like my like flow sheets with everybody. But yeah, that was really helpful too, to kind of put together the information from the research and their nutrition book and all of that, but also like the nutrition care manual to have a really more of a deep understanding about surgery, and then also their specific procedures too.
Do you think anything was like a huge challenge going into it, or what would you say were probably the biggest challenges or the hardest things adjusting to this kind of work?
Definitely using Epic, because there was like an onboarding for like get to know Epic, and I didn't have access actually when I did the training. So when I ended up using it for the first time, it was like one of the days that I was just observing one of the other dietitians. So like being able to like navigate it was pretty overwhelming. And then also charting and talking at the same time. Like again, like the appointments are anywhere from like 10 minutes to, now my appointments are like 8 minutes most of the time, but like 10 minutes to 20 minutes at the most. And 20 minutes again is really only if you're doing a new patient visit. And being able to like chart, like find everything in Epic, be charting, and be able to like complete my note by the end of the appointment, that was really hard, because when I would do my appointments, in my private practice, I would take shorthand notes on a piece of paper. And then at the end of the appointment, I would transcribe those, and I would, spend time after the appointment. I didn't have to rush through anything and didn't need to worry about charting and all of that. And I always used to say like, oh, it'll take away from the patient appointment. But now I've learned that that's not necessarily the case. You can be charting at the same time. There's a way to do it that's not like you're not paying attention to the patient at all, obviously. But I got a lot faster at charting and talking at the same time, and knowing how to find all the information really quickly. So like that flow, that was really hard initially, just getting used to like how short everything was, and then also how new literally everything was.
So you mentioned you got good at charting during your appointments and stuff. What other skills would you say you've gained from working this contract?
So definitely like I've redesigned my my own chart notes for better flow and like what things I actually
your own chart notes for your practice.
Yeah, for my practice. So like I took out stuff, I changed, the way that I have things situated on the chart note, because this is the way that I typically would ask these questions. So instead of having to like scroll through and find it, which then prevented me from charting during the appointment, I, changed how that note was structured. I also obviously have a much deeper understanding of bariatric surgery and then also post-op requirements, which is interesting because there's a couple patients that I have that are post-bariatric surgery, but a couple years out, that I kind of revisited a couple of things with them based on the knowledge that I have. But also I've actually gotten a couple new patients, like not anything to do with the clinic that I was at, but that just found me from their insurance website and were like, oh, you happen to also know about bariatric surgery? That's great, because I'm having bariatric surgery or something. And so they might be working with a hospital system, but looking for that extra, care outside of, what they're getting with their appointments. So that's definitely been really helpful with getting the skills there.
Yeah. I mean, you could also say bariatric surgery is now another point of expertise for you because you slammed through like hundreds of appointments over the course of several months. It's something that you have a lot of experience in now comparatively. And then obviously you got a lot of reps in too, just in general with having appointments with people, hundreds of new patient contacts. I mean, if you want to learn how to do this really quickly, just bang through a bunch of appointments. I mean, how many, obviously you see clients for your practice, you've been doing it for several years, but through the course of this, however many months long contract, you saw as many patients as you might see in your practice over the course of like a year, 2, 3, it depends on how busy you are, but.
No, that is exactly like clinic days when there's like double bookings and they're like in 15-minute increments. It's like, oh, there's 20 patients on the schedule for today. And it's like, how are we going to see all the, and you end up seeing them all. There's, maybe people who no show or cancel, but 20 appointments. And then I do the same thing again on Thursday and then Friday. And so definitely so much exposure with just working with more patients and having more of those skills, but then also again, like a very steep in that bariatric world too. So
you're seeing as many patients in a day as you might see in a week or a month if you're slower, and it's all just in one day and you're going through it. It's obviously it's trial by fire. You're learning. You have to.
Yeah. And there's definitely, I mentioned communication and when I first started, I was texting some of the other dietitians of like, how do you normally handle these questions? Or, I don't know about this. Like if I didn't realize that with coffee, like you can't have coffee after surgery, but it's because of the caffeine content. And so they're allowed to have like a decaf coffee. Or like I learned from the nursing portion that like they obviously can't have like acrylic nails or like their nails painted for surgery because they have to be able to like check their oxygen levels and look at their nail beds and all that kind of stuff.
Capillary refill rate or whatever, doing all that.
Yeah, I didn't know anything about that. And so, but I would ask I didn't know some of these things, and some things didn't really matter for what I was doing, but just being able to like communicate with other healthcare professionals so intimately too. Like that was something that I just don't have as much in being in private practice. I might call a physician's office for labs or maybe coordinate care, but a lot of this is not necessarily where I'm communicating with a physician or a nurse practitioner on a daily basis. And here I am like texting nurse practitioners about different things or, touching base with them about a patient and, talking about how to troubleshoot something if, a patient having an issue with like nausea after surgery and is it related to this or is it related to that? And so that was also really cool to have that kind of setting, is to work, with other healthcare professionals, but also very different than what I was used to too.
So when it's all said and done, would you do another contract with Dietitians on Demand?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially I like the idea of being able to work remote and being able to do, something working from home like what I would for my practice. But I was planning on this contract ending in August, and I'm still finishing out the contract that I'm in now until the beginning of November now, because it just kept getting extended because they just needed, a dietitian still. So that's a little more difficult to juggle it during the school year with my own practice and then teaching alongside of it. But yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, there were certainly some weeks and days where you were excruciatingly busy, where you're just flooring it for like 12 hours.
Yes. Although what is nice, which usually from like 12 to 1 for most of the sites. Tends to be like lunch, which for some days, like when the days where I was like just so behind in clinic day, I would like be able to like actually catch up. But also it was a nice kind of break to be able to like step away, but then also do some pre-charting for like the afternoon. I'm like less worried about that pre-charting now because again, I'm a lot faster, but like that was really helpful that they had like blocks of time where they normally would have their dedicated lunch, or they would it would almost be like a catch-up time frame. So that was really helpful.
Any closing thoughts with your experience in bariatrics for Dietitians on Demand?
I mean, I just think it's a really good option. And I think even if you decide that this is not something like contract work isn't what your long-term goal is, I didn't realize that I was going to gain so many skills and things. I was just, and I went into it with like, this could be a really great opportunity and whatnot, but I had a way to kind of get some more knowledge in this area, but also work in a space that I feel good about, but also did not realize that I was going to learn as much as I did. And being able to learn another system like Epic, I feel like has been really helpful in understanding like navigating that. But just, if you are working in a contract, know that it will probably be pretty overwhelming initially because you're literally jumping into a role and you're expected kind of for it to be something pretty quick that you can just kind of jump in and start. And what I would highly suggest is creating cheat sheets for yourself, writing out, what your flow task is going to look like and just having those things, because that was really invaluable for me as I was kind of learning all the different systems. So as much as you can kind of take notes on stuff, but also like create almost like a cheat sheet, it'll be really helpful with like learning the ropes at a new facility.
I would imagine being somewhat tech savvy helps too, because I remember there were days where you had both monitors and your iPad set up and you're bouncing between devices, and I assume that helps.
Yes, it definitely does help. And even, being able to have, like if you're working with like a company like Dietitians on Demand, like you will have a specific like site supervisor, like from your facility that you'll be at, and making sure that the person that you should be asking questions to. So like I had a couple of dietitians that I could ask the nutrition related questions to. And I had like someone who was like in charge of the schedule that I would reach out to. Kind of like having all that information and knowing who those people are when you first start, because there were times where I like didn't know if I was supposed to do something. And then I didn't know if I should start an appointment because I didn't know if I was supposed to be the one doing that. And it's like be able to have those contacts in place that you're not, especially if you're working remote and you're not like physically in the same place as all these people, to say, okay, here's the person that I would call or text if I'm not sure about X, Y, and Z, and kind of getting that laid out from like day one, because that was really helpful on the days where I was like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do right now. And if I'm supposed to say this or do that, and how I'm supposed to find this information and who that is. And so that was really helpful to have like a list of people that I knew who I was supposed to contact. So
there you have it. A lot of stuff going on with your contract. Seems like it was a really good experience for you just in general.
Yeah, absolutely.
And probably something that if you do this again, you might do it in a different discipline, maybe not bariatrics, but some other discipline. I imagine they have this for other stuff too, like renal or diabetes, like clinics and places that specialize in other illnesses or other areas. Yeah,
I know I've seen like dialysis come up a few times. I know long-term care is just a huge one that is constantly looking for placement. That's like the top ones that I usually see. Dialysis tends to be a little less, and then like outpatient tends to be a little less. So if you do see those kinds of roles, those are ones that kind of snag up, I feel like. But definitely something that I would maybe look into like another area, just to, again, kind of the knowledge, the skill set, and then just, you don't know what you're going to learn. I mean, I didn't realize that I was going to end up changing some of the things I did in my practice just by doing this kind of contract work. I would have never thought that. So
I could see a new dietitian picking up a few of these in different areas and then becoming really versatile over the course of a year, and then just being really sharp when they actually get to a point where they want to jump into a full-time position and sort of devote themselves to a specific field or a specific role.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it would really help them build out like a solid foundation. I could see this being a really good thing for the first couple of years when you're out of school.
Yeah, and they always say, look for clinical experience. I mean, this is a way, I didn't really have much clinical experience because I kind of knew that wasn't what I wanted to do, but this was still like a form of clinical experience that I just didn't really have before. I mean, I had, again, some of that knowledge in terms of like outpatient and working one-on-one with patients and that kind of stuff, but not to this kind of extent and working again, like being in an actual hospital system or anything like that. So that's something that can be really helpful too, is to be able to have that opportunity to get in some clinical experience in different settings. And again, it's just a way to build out your skill set too.
Seems like a viable route as a new dietitian. So I guess we'll call it there. We could do a deep dive into just contract work specifically at some point, or talk about topics adjacent to this. If anyone has any questions or anything like that, feel free to leave a comment if you're on YouTube. But otherwise, that's going to do it for us here at the My Dietitian Journey podcast. Thanks for being with us.